Welcome. Welcome to episode 11 of Reading to Mom. My name is Joe, the publisher at Historia Research near Printers Row in Chicago, Illinois. When we began this project, we had absolutely no idea that it would drag on for 3 long months, as has this pandemic. To say that Chapter 10 is a sudden reversal of everything the author has stated previously about the Provenance would be an understatement. Rather than a great society for democracy and equality, the Provenance is now painted as an empire, colonizing the peoples of the Lyman and committing atrocities against other cultures. Why the author chooses to make this sudden shift in the narrative is, quite frankly, beyond me. But I just want you all to know that this is the last of the strictly historical chapters in the work, and from this point forward, we hope that you will enjoy the fantasy work that the author has presented to us as if a history. Hi, Mom. Chapter 10 is perhaps my favorite in the entire work. It dramatically enlarges the history of the Domain to include the cultures of the Lyman. It introduces 5 new classical powers controlled by an entirely different faculty than reason. And it also complicates the history of the Provenance, as I have told it to this point. It should be recalled that this history, or the events that Sidra recorded, are taking place at the end of the Arcane Age, during the final heptadecades in the fall of the Provenance. Now, to this point, we have emphasized the ideals of the Provenance in its democracy, its equality, and its liberty. But now we have to turn a more critical eye to really understand why the Provenance is coming apart at the seams at this time. Now, the typical publisher of fantasy novels could be quite confused by this turn of events, because they're used to trafficking in stories of conflict between good and evil. It was my hope to break that cycle of literary violence that portrays fantasy cultures in efforts to annihilate each other. In fact, the Arcane Age lasted as long as it did because the cultures of the Lyman and the peoples of the Provenance had a very fruitful exchange over the course of 1,000 years. Here at the end, though, the world seems to be coming apart, and it's not because of any pernicious influence coming from outside the Provenance. It is, I would argue, based on a notion at operation within the Provenance from its earliest epochs. A cancerous notion about who qualifies for self-governance. So without spoiling anything in the chapter, please enjoy Chapter 10. Chapter 10, Tremontaine, the Peoples of the Lyman. On the recommendation of the dynasties, Sidra sought out a wizard known to the local guild as Tigress. Oddly, Sidra first thought she'd never heard of this magician during her lengthy residence in Panoptes. She soon learned the reason for her ignorance when she arrived at the guild. Tigress was an elf, and one of the wizards of Agrigentum. Sidra had few opportunities to interact with the wizards of Agrigentum during her apprenticeship under a member of the High Council. True to their well-established reputation, the first philosophers, as the wizards of Panoptes respectively referred to their brethren, rarely interceded in the political life of the province. That's not to say the namesakes of Agrigentum, the architect who sketched the first stanza of the Provenantial culture and set in motion the longue durée of the Arcane Age, deplored political life. Footnote 1. Longue durée, the long term, a concept introduced by Bernard Flauner, Libua et le plan de Libua à l'âge de récupération. Libua and the Libuan plains in the age of recovery. Published in Paris, 701 of the Golden Age. End footnote. That's not to say the namesakes of Agrigentum, the architect who sketched the first stanzas of the Provenantial culture and set in motion the longue durée of the Arcane Age, deplored political life. To the contrary, the wizards of Agrigentum possessed a phenomenal knack for intervening in the affairs of the High Council at auspicious moments in the history of the Provenance. As the arcane adage suggests,
the wisdom of first philosophers bellows, inaudibly, until destiny resounds their prescience for inevitable ends.
The cleric and the wizard quickly befriended each other. Sidra neglected to record in detail the specifics of the exchange, but suffice it to say, the cleric ingratiated herself with great facility. She had learned to interact with the wizards of Panoptes, and her mentor taught her all wizards suffered from a weakness for flattery. They are the arcanists who dedicate the most time and effort to attain their station, more often than not without any assurance of success. A magician may spend 24 years in an apprenticeship only to discover they did not possess the essential care to master the volatile wisdom. The apprentices witnessed many classmates' hopes and friendships dissipate in the effete plume of a low-grade fireball. Those who attained the title, roughly translating as thaumaturgist of philosophy, often regarded themselves as unworthy of the accomplishment, despite initiation into the guildship for masters. Footnote 2. The attainment of mastery in thaumaturgy was often accompanied by feelings of estrangement and alienation. With this knowledge, Sidra deployed her wiles against the unsuspecting wizard who ventured far from the towers of Agrigentum, and won his allegiance to her cause. End footnote. Sidra deftly exploited wizard's shame for success to win over one of Agrigentum's kind. Once again, though, we, the historians of a far distant age, gather the fruits of Sidra's labors. She offered this telling description of her new colleague.
Tigris stood around 4 cubits tall, lanky and unimposing in physical stature. He shaved his head clean, exposing the enlarged tips at the tops of his ears and the gaunt cut of his face around prominent cheekbones. Like other elves I have met, his dark skin glowed with the aura of his classical power and enlarged his presence in the mind's eye. As the elves are rumored to never age, Tigris gave me the distinct impression that he had lived for at least a few epochs.
As a wizard of Agrigentum, he wore the customary robes to signify his mastery of the most arcane of the classical powers. The strap cinching his regalia contained a number of small rings to attach pouches, potions, and scrolls. Despite his apparent efforts to care for his finery, the outfit showed signs of wear from his many excursions into the Lyman to advance his studies of the region and its peoples. From out of the small satchel on his back, his familiar, a small, lengthy rodent with a beautiful coat of fur, emerged and perched itself on his shoulder early in our conversation. When the wizard introduced his companion by name, Katidios, the creature seemed to raise its paws and nod its head as if to greet me. The marten listened to our exchange, purposefully, and at times pressed his nose to the tigress's ear to distract the magician.
Footnote 3. Coincidentally, Sidra's records contain the first substantial mention of the wizard's familiar, Peridrikos, a weasel-like creature by her account. Wizards and sorcerers somehow align their own minds, freeing, with the minds, freeing, of small animals, in order to amplify particular abilities or spells. When, in the darkness of a pouch or under a hood, the animals had only their natural intelligence. When in tandem with their magicians, the animals had an enhanced intelligence compared to others in the species that aided the spellcasters in various ways. For example, a hawk, familiar in flight, extended the distance of spells or delivered attacks requiring touch. Katidios, as a member of the Mystulidae family, heighten the power of the wizard's spells. Future events will allow deeper exploration of the enhancements offered by familiars. For now, it must suffice to say that the bond of wizard and familiar was a complementary bond, entangling both strength and liability. In footnote, the fortuitous commingling of the cleric and wizard provides modernity with the most complete account of the history of the Lyman and the Provenance from the Arcane Age. Tucked inside the recently discovered journals of Sidra from the excavation at Tityos, archaeologists also recovered an arcane work entitled
The Demotic Lyman, as written by the disciple of Agrigentum and scholar of the Acropolis, Tigris.
The Wizard's Scroll, stretching to 41 cubits in length, when unrolled end to end, recounts the history of the Lyman and the Provenance from first contact to the first heptadecades of the Acropolis. This work is currently the most complete contemporary account by a single author of the conflict between the Provenance and the Lyman during the Arcane Age. Footnote 4. While historians have pieced together compelling accounts of certain events as far back as the early epochs of the Arcane Age, the dearth of sources that documented the ineluctable conflict between the Provenance and the Lyman has frustrated scholars' efforts to form a consensus. Tigris's recently discovered work, not yet published in a modern language for popular consumption, remains relatively unknown outside of the discipline. Due to an agreement pertaining to the financing of the excavation at Tityos, Tigris's scroll is held by the National Museum of Arcane Archaeology and Classical Wisdoms of Peru, in Lima, Peru. The translation, which follows, is my own, with immense gratitude to my colleagues Fanchili King and Ese Mizare. End footnote. Before proceeding with our prosaic narrative of Sidra's second crossing into the expanse of the Lyman, the modern reader will gain immensely from familiarization with the latest and most fantastic advances in historians' understanding of the Arcane Age peoples. The boundary defining the Provenance from the Lyman was as ephemeral as it was mercurial. If one asked a provenantial citizen, "Who are the peoples of the Lyman?" the answer would depend on which heptadecade of the Arcane Age the inquirer posed the question. At the same time, although certain peoples stood within and without the laws of the Provenance, the erstwhile citizen of the Provenance would be hard-pressed to define exactly where the Provenance ended and the Lyman began. In fact, the civilization of the Provenance always exceeded the jurisdiction of its laws. Concurrently, both preternatural and arcane divisions complicated the popular sentiment that the peoples of the Provenance united in a common civic community, or even should be united for such a cause. In the earliest epochal primes of the Arcane Age, most citizens of the Provenance arguably refused to consider each other as members of one civil society. For most, allegiances to the former preternatural age cities trumped allegiance to the nascent political order formed by the constitution of the councils. The displaced denizens of the lost western cities in the earliest years of the Arcane Age held fast to their origins no less than the Naxians and Panopticons. Remarkably, the few remaining records of the councils from the first epochal prime never refer to the Provenance as such. Instead, the official documents of both chambers of the councils reference their coalition merely as citizens of our cities united in council by Provenance, as if in reference to the Glorious Revolution. Footnote 5. For a fuller treatment of the topic, see Villa Coquette, Democracy in the Provenance, Chapter 5, Parts 1 through 3. End footnote. More so than the text of their constitution, the peoples of the Provenance found unity in their opposition to the societies of the Lyman. Strangely enough, prior to the Arcane Age, the diligent scholar finds no substantive references to the diverse peoples of the Provenance and the Lyman. Throughout the preternatural age, the languages of the Demen knew the distinction between rulers and ruled, but the seven godheads and their obsequious followers shared in one common physiological and cultural designation, Anthropodon. Footnote 6. Curiously, the term Anthropodon not only encompasses the species, Anthropos, or human, but also to the social conditions of the species, Padoion, translating as captive or slave. The preternatural and Arcane Age peoples seem to have the remarkable insight that they were not only beings, but social beings, evolved from a particular political and economic condition, human captivity and slavery to the godheads. And footnote. Throughout the preternatural age, the languages of the Damen knew the distinction between rulers and ruled, but the seven godheads and their obsequious followers shared in one common physiological and cultural designation, Anthropodon. Anthropodon encompassed all manner of what today we consider human in physiology, society, and class. From aristocrat to peasant, mercenary to farmer, the preternatural peoples shared one genealogy. Footnote 7. An important difference from the racialist ideology that dominated the Middle Age and much of the Golden Age in our world history. The aristocracy of the preternatural cities did not establish their distance from the peasants with the concepts of racial difference, birthright, or even nobility of character. The aristocrats of the preternatural age erected an unstable artifice, in part merit, and in part family fortune, or luck, to explain the wealth and station certain families attained during the preternatural age. The similarities are such that one must wonder if the classical playwright Provenance unwittingly targeted the naive premise of preternatural aristocrats in his comedy, Wealth. From Athens, circa, or about, 2609 of the Middle Age. End footnote. Anthropodon encompassed all manner of what today we consider human in physiology, society, and class. From aristocrat to peasant, mercenary to farmer, the preternatural peoples shared one genealogy. After the Glorious Revolution, the languages of the Arcane Age suddenly burst with all manner of distinctions and typologies among the Anthropodon in the Damen. While the peoples of the Arcane Age, educated by the egalitarian pathos and words of Agrigentum, proved too sophisticated to entertain any notion that race is destiny, as industrial barons and social Darwinians professed during the Golden Age. Footnote 8. For a comparative review of Arcane Metal and Golden Age ideologies of biological difference, see Jacob May Schoenefter, Anthropodon of a Different Form, published in Cambridge, 757 of the Golden Age. End footnote. While the peoples of the Arcane Age, educated by the egalitarian pathos and words of Agrigentum, proved too sophisticated to entertain any notion that race is destiny, as industrial barons and social Darwinians professed during the Golden Age, a figurative abyss seemed to separate the people of the Provenance from the cultures of the Lyman. To our modern eye, the antagonism seemed to be more illusory than substantial. The most heinous thieves, barbarians, and sorcerers frequently secured comfortable lives and renown in the Provenance. At the same time, the common people and councils of the Provenance often vilified the accomplished geniuses and most diplomatic leaders of the Lyman. Only the lens of time makes it possible for current researchers to begin to understand the contribution the cultures of the Lyman made to the entire history of the Arcane Age and the culture of the Damen. Notably, Tigris's work, The Demonic Lyman, lacks the typical animus directed at the Lyman peoples. Moreover, the short exegesis on his contemporaries may be the most significant statement on the Lyman ever composed, despite the fact that he wrote the tract many millenniums ago. Remarkably, as well, the treatise provides an account of the Provenance's first contact with a unique culture of the Lyman, the Elves. Cultural historians have long dated the first historical record of the Elves to the first epochal prime of the Provenance. A shard of mosaic, carbon dated to the era, shares an early proverb attributing long life to the Elves.
Pity the elf whose logos is severed short amidst the adamantine shears of combat. What blessed lives severe time shudders to break, arcane powers heedlessly annihilate.
Footnote 9. A Lucinian stone, a mosaic from Panoptes around the second epoch, third heptachide decade of the Arcane Age. End footnote. No other artifact or scripture referencing one of the many peoples of the Arcane Age predates this adage, and little evidence disputes the assertion that the Elves represent the first arcane culture to enter into the history of the Provenance. The common names in the arcane tongues translate to Denelos, meaning long-lived, and Ekpalal, the early cognate of our modern word elf, which translates as for a long while, in reference to their unnatural life expectancy. Perhaps because he himself was an elf, Tigris adds only a few brief entries recounting the origin of his people. While his narrative contributes little to our previous knowledge, his analysis provides a clear indication that the new culture seemed to originate in the Lyman. He also fills in a completely unknown chapter about the first contact between elves and the Provenance. Even so, scholars' review of his texts for an answer regarding the first elves has shown that Tigris himself proves to be as coy as his predecessors. In his account, the Anthropoid wizards of Agrigentum introduced the councils to the first Lyman culture from the Arcane Age. Shorter, often gaunt, with an ashen complexion, the elves otherwise differed less conspicuously from the peoples of the Provenance than later cultures encountered during the age. The few extant documents record one consistent characteristic of the elves: their mastery of the most challenging specialty of the arcane wisdoms, thaumaturgy. Every pertinent reference on the elves during the epoch describes them as magicians, as if the entire population possessed the arcane ability to join geos and ether. Footnote 10. This, understandably, did not go unnoticed among scribes and chronologists, many of whom once aspired to become wizards before settling on the mechanic arts of scroll-making or the bureaucratic role of scrivener. End footnote. Every pertinent reference on the elves during the epoch describes them as magicians, as if the entire population possessed the arcane ability to join geos and ether. The significant aspect of Tigris's brief treatise is, nonetheless, the first application of the term tramontane to his own cadre of philosophers. Before the councils, the wizards of Agrigentum introduced their new colleagues as tramontane, meaning from beyond the mountains. A reminder that the wizards of Agrigentum erected their towers in the northern range of the Ferris Mountains to the southwest of Panoptes. The allusion suggested Agrigentum's order knew nothing more than that the elves came to the Provenance as if from over the mountains. And for nearly the entirety of the Arcane Age, the citizens of the Provenance, both arcane and common, seemed merely to know this vague reference to the arduous passage of a mysterious clan of mages over the snow-capped range. Aside from Tigris's text, the late Arcane Age archives offer no evidence that the peoples of the Provenance also referred to the elves as tramontane in its early years. Eras. Rather, the term first came into widespread use during the second epochal prime of the Provenance, most closely associated with the subsequent cultures discovered in the Lyman. Initially, however, the term applied to the two cultures the Provenance encountered in close succession, the Dwarves and the Orcs, both of which claimed to originate in the Ferris Mountains. While the councils regarded both populations as tramontane at first contact, the two peoples obviously experienced vastly disparate outcomes in their diplomatic relations with the Provenance. On the one hand, the councils eventually welcomed the dwarves into the political order of the Provenance and conferred full representation in the polity of self-governance to the new allies. On the other hand, the Orcs suffered one of the most horrific treacheries perpetrated during the Arcane Age and never attained equal representation in the Provenance in any meaningful sense. Although certain details of these events have been known for many centuries, Tigris's intervention forces the modern scholar to reassess the meaning of tramontane and the significance of these early encounters in the conflicts between the Provenance and the Lyman. The history begins with Paline's defeat and the plight of the fighters in the early Arcane Age. Few fighters survived the defense of Paline. For many years following the conclusion to the Glorious Revolution, the Fighters' Guilds struggled to preserve their wisdom and train younger generations to excel at the combatants' classical power. Few pursued their calling for a lifetime. With only a score of mentors and even fewer pupils in the earlier Heptaikai decades, Melee philosophy nearly became the first of the arcane wisdoms to be extinguished. 173 years after the Glorious Revolution, the Fighters' Guilds at long last replenished their numbers to the point where their interests and voice in the High Council influenced the policies of the Republic. Despite recovery of the population, the Fighters' Guilds had forgotten many of the most advanced insights of their philosophy following the Glorious Revolution. In part, the decline arose from the limited availability of technologies and resources. The quality of wood-fired forges never approached the raw infernal heat of the lava forges of Pylene. Without the molten resource to craft refined weaponry and armor, none of the fighters of the Provenance practiced in or trained others to use the most powerful capabilities of their class for several generations. Footnote 11. Other philosophers in the High Council of the Provenance regarded the fighters as backward and largely useless companions. Before the recovery of Pylene, the wisdom of melee combat seemed to have peaked during the preternatural age. According to an apocryphal story, the mischievous rogues once introduced legislation to strip fighters of a place on the High Council. The rogues suggested,
2 commoners can defeat our most powerful fighters. They deserve no more than a half vote on the People's Council.
The tall tale alludes to the entertainment of staged combats between fighters and commoners, in which the number of commoners against a single fighter grew incrementally. While the first commoners in the combat normally evaded the clumsy fighter until a critical mass of commoners tipped the balance of power in their favor, quite a few hapless fighters are said to have fallen against 2 commoners. After each defeat, no matter how spectacular, a cleric raised the featured fighter from the dead, and a new contest was organized for the cleric's off-smitten puppets. And footnote. Without the molten resource to craft refined weaponry and armor, none of the fighters of the Provenance practiced in or trained others to use the most powerful capabilities of their class for several generations. Among the fighters of the Provenance, understandably, a last hope for recovering their original stature among the classical powers took hold.
We fighters will recover our great wisdom when we stoke the mighty forges of Pylene anew.
For many years, the prophecy was nothing more than an unfulfilled dream the fighters told themselves during a night of hard drinking. Meanwhile, the clerics and the wizards seemed content with the local craftsmanship of their native cities, and management of the High Council and the Providence consumed the time and interest of the 2 most influential classical powers of the era. Thus, the events of the Glorious Revolution and the circumstances of an ascent age conspired to reduce the combat philosophers to a class of malcontents who battled imaginary dragons and conquered undefended citadels. With the additional knowledge of the elves' origin beyond the Ferris Mountains, an intervention by the Wizards of Agrigentum that restored the classical power of melee combat demands more attention. While the Wizards of Agrigentum rarely participated in the political life of the Provenance, when they did so, they always won the favor of the Wizards of Panoptes. In this instance, when membership in the Fighters' Guilds reached the highest level since the Glorious Revolution, Agrigentum's namesakes recommended to the councils more consideration for an adventuring party to reclaim the lost volcanic city of the preternatural age. Moreover, the Wizards proposed the peoples of the Provenance dedicate themselves to the extension of democracy to the entire domain.
The Provenance cannot fulfill its promise, its origin, if its peoples have no end. Make manifest the destiny of your laws. Go forth, build an empire for liberty.
Footnote 12. From Tigris, Demotic Lyman, stanza 149. And footnote. Thus, in the 3rd quarter of the 2nd epochal prime of the Arcane Age, the Fighters' Guilds in Panoptes and Naxos petitioned the councils to fund an expedition to the lost city of Pylene. No less than the 11th such proposed sent to the councils. The intervention of the Wizards of Agrigentum triggered the first full debate before both deliberative bodies. Despite the opposition, mostly from the aristocratic and commercial interests of the cities, the fighters, at long last, secured an opportunity to reclaim the birthplace and the volcanic smithy of their classical power. Footnote 13. The fighters won the support of aristocrats and merchants only after the councils agreed. First, private investments, not public taxes, would fund the expedition. And second, the Republic provided free and safe passage between the cities for all commoners. The historian Wang di Orodo, in his work Empire of Liberty, A History of the Provenance During the Arcane Age, published in New York, 761 of the Golden Age. The historian Wang di Orodo argues that these two concessions destined the Provenance to expand across the great continent of the Demesne during the Arcane Age. End footnote. Despite opposition, mostly from the aristocratic and commercial interests of the cities, the fighters, at long last, secured an opportunity to reclaim the birthplace and volcanic smithy of their classical power. The High Council recruited and outfitted the arcane force for the adventure, but the People's Council struggled to secure contracts to fund the operation. As a consequence, 3 more years passed before the military throng departed from the gates of Naxos, showered with cheers and toasts from the intoxicated crowd, which gathered at a week-long festival to mark the event. The journey to Pallene proved more arduous than treacherous. The absence of traffic between Naxos and the preternatural age city of Pallene rendered the road impassable without backbreaking efforts to clear a path. Only 3 days from the gates of Naxos, the leaders of the expedition realized they had enlisted insufficient expertise in the mechanical arts of masonry, logging, and carpentry. The expedition nearly ended in disaster after many fell ill with dysentery during the first month. For a fortnight, the disease forced the militia to encamp in a small clearing near running water, while the clerics exhausted their arcane powers to restore the sick to full health. A bivouac they did not plan on. Immobile and vulnerable, a large pride of griffins spotted the weak prey and assaulted the bedridden force on the 3rd night. Several arcanists died, including a highly regarded master of the fighters, who championed the effort and rallied the troops when the morale flagged. Subsequently, more judicious in their use of healing spells to treat the diseased, the troop lingered under the threat of imminent attack and mutiny for weeks. During a second assault by the Griffins several days later, the militia demonstrated great preparation, turning back the flying beasts. While several more of the pioneers failed to survive the infectious blight, the force remained of sufficient size to continue just as the heat and protection of summer waned. An early snowstorm invited disease, frostbite, and the unexpected force of never-before-seen magical beasts that further slowed the advance of the expedition. The demands for clerical powers forced the company to establish an encampment to endure a harsh winter on the edge of the Ladon forest without further progress. The following spring, the pace of the expedition fared no better, and the destitute band barely escaped exposure to a second harsh winter. In the 17th month, the laborious trek finally ended on the stony steps leading to the great arches of the preternatural citadel of Pallene, when the chilly autumn nights whispered perils of the impending dead season in the wind. Nothing, however, in their aspirations or travels prepared the first wayfarers for what they discovered at Pallene.
Fatigued, frail, the first wayfarers ascended, each step extinguishing the flame of the dream that animated their momentous journey. When round the final switchback, their strides grew weak. As before them, the walls of the citadel stood tall, intact, insuperable, occupied. The sorcerer of Titios, the some gasped. Determined, if forlorn, the wayfarers trudged to confront their mortal enemy once more.
Footnote 14. Tigris, Demotic Lineman, stanza 191 to stanza 193. End footnote. The miserable explorers silently approached the gates, certain their adventure must end in surrender or death. Unexpectedly, one of the commoners cried out,
Sorcerer of Titios, treacherous fool, the Provenance commands you, return Pallene.
A pall hung over the Provenancial expedition as the situation seemed to grow direr as the moments passed without response. Then, abruptly, large metal gears set in motion with a clamorous clang to pierce the minatory silence, and the impenetrable stone gates began to open. Swinging outward. Footnote 15. Typically, the arcane gates of cities and strongholds swung inward toward the dwelling. This was because hinges, a preternatural invention, are secured on the side the door opens. If a population built a fortress with outward swinging gates, the hinges would be on the exterior and expose to enemies who may simply unhinge the gates. One weakness, though, of the typical fortress entrance was that gates are designed to swing in the direction that an enemy presses into the city. Pallene's gates, unique to the Arcane Age, secured by an unrecorded technology, permitted the doors to swing outward without exposing a hinge or fixtures of the gates to the enemy. During the war with the sorcerer Titios, many fighters who survived the conflict attributed their long defense of the citadel to the design of the gates. Clearly, our medieval forebears could have benefited from a little more arcane ingenuity. End footnote. Swinging outward, the obsidian gates pushed a throng of weary travelers back down the embankment. The soft sound of exhalations moved like a wave from the front and center lines of the Arcanus as the gap widened. The opening in the doors revealed a company of stocky, muscular soldiers dressed in the common attire of fighters and decorated with long hair and braided beards flowing from beneath their helmets. And so it was the emigres of Naxos and Panoptes stumbled upon a war between two cultures theretofore never encountered in the short history of the Provenance, and previously unrecorded in the written or archaeological texts preserved until today: the dwarves and the orcs. At this moment, the two peoples enter the history of the Arcane Age, locked in a bitter conflict in which both regarded Peline as the ultimate prize. The dwarves referred to the stronghold as Peleon, the ancient gate, while the orcs more directly as Tropeon, trophy. Both vied for control of the citadel for nearly an epochal prime, according to the lore and legends of the battles they subsequently passed on in oral traditions. Neither side dominated the other or controlled the citadel for long. Peline changed possession no less than 3 times during the Second Arcane Epoch, the third time occurring in the months just prior to the arrival of the Provenance's troops. Consequently, good fortune, rather than skilled diplomacy, favored the dwarves in the acts of treachery soon to transpire against the orcs. Footnote 16. At the risk of engaging in the futility of counterfactual analysis, let it suffice to say, had the Provenance made better progress from Naxos and arrived a few months earlier, or perhaps a few years later, the history of the first contact between the dwarves, orcs, and anthropodons may have taken a different course. Yet, we shall never know how events may have transpired if the orcs held the citadel on first contact, and it is a pointless exercise to surmise outcomes contrary to the historical facts. End footnote. Consequently, good fortune, rather than skilled diplomacy, favored the dwarves in the acts of treachery soon to transpire against the orcs. The word dwarf is of modern derivation and holds no relationship with the name of the dwarven people in the arcane languages. The most common designation, and the one dwarves took for themselves, Kemezelon, translates as those seeking the ground or low growing. The term also meant of a low estate, which may explain the increasing use of Destainon in the early Arcane Age, an apparent slur that translates as wretched, unlucky, or lacking fortune. Another roguish invention, to be sure. By the late Arcane Age, the dwarves' faculty for mechanics earned them a third title, Benosos, or artisan, to describe their useful labors in the erection of strongholds for the Provenance. True to the popular stereotype of the dwarves, the population preferred to settle in fortifications on mountainsides, worked hard and carefully at their crafts during the day, exhibited great heroism in battle, and drank prodigiously in the evenings and at celebrations. While often skilled in mining and resource extraction, however, the provenantial dwarves did not chisel great underground networks of roads and settlements as one modern characterization suggests. Peline, the one example of a palatial city carved inside of a mountain peak, took shape in the preternatural age long before the Damen heard mention of the dwarves. Rather, the culture produced the gifted and dedicated mechanic artists of the age who resurrected the great cities of the Provenance. Throughout the Arcane Age, the dwarves engineered and reinforced the firmaments of the Provenance. With a unique proclivity for the calculating genius, the society educated their youth from a young age to master the elements of geos and anime. For this reason, while most populous in Peline, a dwarven diaspora, after first contact with the Provenance, dispersed the culture throughout the Damen and indelibly cast the Arcane Age in the twin offspring of dwarven masonry and craftsmanship. The unique and admirable dedication to the study of geos and anime, what modern people have long called mechanical and civil engineering, also seemed to stimulate the discovery of the classical power of fighters among the culture. The young, by most estimates, discovered an knack for combat philosophy twice as often as an Anthropodan youth demonstrated any faculty for one of the arcane wisdoms. The cost, it seems, was that a young Kamezalon, rarely of note in recorded history, possessed abilities attributed to the other classical powers. The specialization, in conjunction with toilsome instruction in the mechanic arts at a young age, tended to result in stout adults who stood 2/3 cubits shorter on average than the Anthropodons of Naxos and Panoptes. Like nearly all cultures of the Demen, gender distinctions did not divide the dwarven population in two, for both male and female dwarves pursued the arcane wisdoms, mechanic arts, or other callings as revealed to, or willed by, the respective individuals, regardless of gender. In contrast to the Kamezalon, the modern designation for the orcs closely resembles the most frequent name recorded by the Provenance, Orga, which also carried the meaning of temper, feelings, and impulses in the arcane tongues. Immediately, as the term suggests, the people of the Provenance came to know the new people for their temperament before any other distinction. Mistakenly as well, the earliest accounts describe their physiognomy as gray-green skin contorted into beastly scowls. In fact, the Orga culture was the first in the recorded history of the Demen to paint their faces before battle in order to make their visages look more hideous and frightful to their adversaries. This singular customary practice serves to explain the second most common term for the arcane orcs, barbaron, which is the arcane word that corresponds to the modern barbarian. Now, the discerning reader will have noticed several chapters ago, when first introduced to Matna and other Mixellen, that the label of barbarian seemed to apply to many cultures originating in the Lyman. Was this merely another prejudice of the Provenance against the cultures of the Lyman? The simplest answer, yes and no. As the budding scholar will recall, the discovery of the classical powers resulted in one anomaly in Agrigentum's system of elements. Two different kinds of wisdom stemmed from the commingling of Geos and Anime, the fighters and the rogues. The elemental philosophy of Agrigentum was unable to account for the discrepancy in what otherwise formed to make a self-contained and complete exegesis on the nature of the arcane wisdoms. Realized in the final years of the preternatural age by the rogues and Titios, the peoples of the Demen possessed no less than two distinct faculties to harness the classical powers of the elements: reason and passions. While the calculating fighters controlled Geos and Anime with the force of reason, the impulsive rogues drew forth the powers of the two commingled elements under the guile of passions. Likewise, every pairing of the elements presented two discrete kinds of arcane wisdom determined by the faculty that commingled the elements. For instance, the clerics shared the elements of anime and ether with the melodious bards, and the sorcerers combined Geos and ether like their counterparts the wizards. In total, the cultures of the Arcane Age discovered 12 basic wisdoms, 6 passionate and 6 reasonable, before the fateful loss of arcane philosophy. See Illustration 8. Illustration 8. Classical powers of reason and passions. At the top left, Agrigentum's syllabogram of the elements. At the bottom left, the Arcane Age logograms for the classical powers, as commingled by reason, wizards, clerics, druids, rangers, fighters, and paladins, or by the passions, sorcerers, bards, necromancers, barbarians, rogues, and daemonists. To the right, a regular dodecahedron representing the 12 arcane philosophies of the period. End Illustration 8. In total, the cultures of the Arcane Age discovered 12 basic wisdoms, 6 passionate and 6 reasonable, before the fateful loss of arcane philosophy. By chance, the rogues and fighters first discovered the two faculties to commingle elements when both mastered Geos and Anime in the late preternatural age. At its founding then, the Provenance harbored 7 classical powers, but only one of the passionate wisdoms earned a seat in the High Council of the untested democratic society. The rogues, both citizens and outcasts in the Provenance, earned representation, if not acceptance, in the burgeoning empire. The liminality of the rogues traces to the concept of reason, a word that was always singular in general references during the Arcane Age. Reason is one and indivisible, so to speak, and it transcends subjectivity, such that the intellectual faculty is one nature for all individuals who exercise high-minded reason. For the 6 arcane philosophies pregnant with reason, the arcanists shared in common the belief that they controlled their powers with a selfless and sublime faculty. For instance, Hemifus, Brajana's people on the Libyan plains, whose stature and build was much like the goblinoids and koboloi, found that their mastery of the reasonable classical power, Druidism, earned their kind immediate representation on the High Council. On the other hand, passions, always plural when referenced in general in the Provenance, derive from the subjectivity and emotive force of the individuals who stirred them. The few fragments describing the disposition of the passionate classical powers indicate one particular emotion dominated in the combination of the 2 elements. Thus, each passionate philosophy traced its first cause to one of the 6 arcane passions of the Demen's peoples. The sorcerers mastered the passion of dread, while the bards evoked the passion of grief. The demonists compelled the passion of wonder, whereas the barbarians unleashed the passion of rage. Footnote 17. To learn more about the 6 arcane passions, see Alan U. Kemp, Passions Revealed, Understanding the Classical Powers and Arcane Feelings, a PhD dissertation at the Weathermark Center for Rumination on the Classical Powers, published in 907 of the Golden Age. End footnote. Rogues gained a voice in the New Republic by virtue of the particular passion used to unite Geos and Anime. Desire. Footnote 18. In our time, the explanation seems transparent. As humanoids, all the cultures of the Provenance required coupling to produce offspring, and desire served as a favorable genetic trait in that regard. To the arcane peoples, however, tidy explanations bound up with the reproductive imperatives held no meaning. End footnote. Rogues gained a voice in the New Republic by virtue of the particular passion used to unite Geos and Anime. Desire. Desire, the passion of the rogues, endorsed in a manner the avarice of merchants and mechanics. Consequently, the People's Council fought every effort to regulate the activity of rogues, or to exclude the classical power of roguery from the representation of the Provenance. And whereas reason advised prudence and apprehension in all decision-making, the passion of desire excited the peoples of the Provenance with the hope and resilience to make the treacherous journey across the domain and to achieve an end or obtain an object in the limen. In this respect, the Provenance itself displayed a particular roguishness in its expansion. Nevertheless, other cultures, adept in the passionate philosophies, more often than not, became identified with the limen. The discovery of the passionate classes and cultures inextricably folds into the history of the Provenance's reclamation of the lost cities of the preternatural age. While these events will easily fill 5 volumes, a project far beyond the scope of this modest work. Footnote 19. In short, the mutuality of the cultures of the domain escaped the ideology of the provenantial citizenry. The gnome sorcerers, whom the councils welcomed into the republican polity of arcanists and commoners, represent one noteworthy exception to the prejudice of the unimpassioned reason. End footnote. While the events will easily fill 5 volumes, a project far beyond the scope of this modest work, let it simply suffice to say that the Provenance shunted the uninhibited cultures who indulged their passions to channel the classical powers into a single underclass, the depraved throng of the despotic limen. Accordingly, to return to Tigress's work, and the history weighing on the judgment of Sidra and the actions of her Sum, the first meeting of the Provenance with Kemezalone and Orga, dwarves and orcs, served to be a germinal moment in our world's history. The orcs, like the dwarves, seem to possess a congenital disposition to a single classical power, barbarism. Barbarians were the elemental cousins of rangers, both of whom commingled the elements of zephyr and ether. Both kinds of philosophers shared traits, independent spirits, often intractable, and prone to venturing into the forest alone. The commonalities in disposition for rangers and barbarians, however, were lost on the contingent sent to reclaim Paline for the Provenance. Footnote 20. Thus, also, we discover the origin of the stereotypical barbarian who chews on thistleweed and other zephyr to match the mood being an ethereal substance and passionate faculty. End footnote. The reproach of barbarians and orcs more than any other barbaric culture of the Lyman stemmed from the passion of their classical power, rage. Similar to our modern discomfort with the emotion of rage, the Provenantial peoples frowned on enraged individuals. For the reasonable arcanists of the Provenance, rage represented several negative inferences in particular. Rage indicated a complete absence of reason, or madness. Rage was never purposeful, as in blind fury. Rage sought destruction for its own sake, in bloodlust. And rage quickly depleted the energies of the enraged, consumed by rage. Notably, the arcane peoples of the Provenance use these terms and phrases, much like we moderns today. Footnote 21. One suspects our modern distaste for madness and rage stems from a long-forgotten discomfort with the painted face of barbarism, the Orga. In the late Arcane Age, barbaron, in the lowercase, signified the classical power of barbarism. In addition, epiprio, meaning to grind with rage at, came into widespread use to describe barbarism as an arcane philosophy practiced in many cultures. End footnote. On the second night, following the arrival of the Provenantial army, the dwarves discovered the designs that had brought a new threat to the ancient gate, Paline. Unfamiliar with the customs and courtesies of the other, tensions mounted between the two cultures when the leaders of the Provenance's wayfarers declared their intention to reclaim the volcanic forges of Paline. If conditions had persisted for just a few more days, the claimants' dispute over the preternatural citadel of Paline surely would have resulted in deadly blows. Footnote 22. On this point, Tigris contributes a heretofore unknown story. A group of Provenantial fighters, and no small contingent, conspired to launch a surprise attack against their hosts, their dwarven hosts, on the seventh night. The plotters regarded Paline as their figural homeland. As Tigris quotes the co-conspirators,
Squat, hirsute rum guzzlers deserve no quarter. After the last drunkard hits the cot at dawn, smite the dwarven revelers in sleep's stupor.
the plot of the perfidious group was not to be, for in the words of Tigris,
Logos of the primes uttered like-minded crimes.
in reference to the imminent treachery of the dwarves against the orcs. From Tigris, Demotic Lyman, stanzas 269 to stanzas 271, my translation. End footnote. If conditions had persisted for just a few more days, the claimants' dispute over the preternatural citadel of Paline surely would have resulted in deadly blows. The conflict was not to be, for on the fourth night the orcs launched a massive assault against the stone bulwarks of Paline.
The Orga horde, masked in hideous war paints, buried Paline in frightening cries of rage. The dwarves, unprepared, distracted by their guests, failed to repel the barbarians' first surge.
Footnote 23. As discussed above, the barbarians' first surge is always the strongest, and successes in exacting a high body count often determined whether the battle ended in a rout or a stalemate. End footnote. To be sure, the rage of the barbaric Orga was like nothing the citizens of the Providence had ever witnessed. The wild screams, the appalling distortion of their physical appearance, and the stench of the blood and guts smeared on their adversaries' armor caused the Provenantial force to recoil in horror at the sight of the treasured city's assailants. Could this strange people of the Lyman be Anthropodon? The Provenantial army's leadership quickly decided, no. For an arcane epoch and longer, the balance of power between the dwarves and the orcs never favored one side or the other. One culture born barbarians, the other born fighters, Their extended conflicts ended when attrition took its toll on both warring parties. That fateful night, with the aid of the Provenance, the dwarves suddenly found themselves in a position of dominance. The healers reinvigorated and revived the dwarven fighters, while the orc barbarians' losses continued to mount. What started as a rout by the invading forces quickly turned against the raging horde. As never before, the dwarven squads largely stood intact, while fatigue set upon the Orga barbarians.
A horrific slaughter ensued as the dwarves, enraptured by the spells of the Provenance, fell upon the exhausted host of Orga.
By daybreak, the dwarves had killed or captured nearly 2/3 of the Orga invaders. The distance of time obscures the exact details of the subsequent events and deliberations. By all accounts. Footnote 24. Tigris's retelling references a work rediscovered in the archaeological digs at Karelsup by one of the lower-ranking fighters of the first Provenantial expedition from Naxos to the West Lyman. Bekirnlaw, Wayfarer Life in the Lyman, a journal of the expedition to reclaim Peline from the throngs of Camizalon, Orga, and assorted beasts during the 13th Heptachite decade following the Glorious Revolution. From Peline, around the third epoch, first period of the Arcane Age. End footnote. The distance of time obscures the exact details of the subsequent events and deliberations. By all accounts, at the end of the conflict, the dwarves locked themselves in the great hall of Peline to confer alone. 4 days and nights they met secretly in assembly to determine the fate of their captives and to decide terms of surrender to impose on the defeated Orga. On the fifth day, they released a baker's dozen prisoners with word directing the Orga to return with a negotiating party to hear the terms of surrender. The dwarves instructed the Orga diplomats to return with 107 in number, including 7 chieftain elders, 29 children under 11 years of age, and 71 offspring of the chieftains or parents of the children. 2 nights later, the Orga mediators arrived in exact size and configuration as the dwarves demanded. Upon entry to the citadel, the dwarven sentries commanded the Orga clan to surrender their weapons and led them to the great hall. After reaching the assembly, the dwarves separated the 7 chieftains and 29 children from their 71 family members by force. They led the Orga chieftains to the dais at the front of the congregation while ushering the Orga children out of the great hall. The proceedings followed swiftly. Jorgos, the leader of the dwarven assembly, immediately accused the 7 Orga elders.
Orga, you committed unforgivable crimes against the rightful claimants to Peline, including slaughter of innocent minors.
Jorgos called for a vote of the assembly to determine the guilt of the Orga leaders. The assembly unanimously judged each of the 7 leaders guilty. Immediately following the ruling, a large red curtain to one side of the assembly rose to reveal a gallows with 7 nooses, secured and prepared for the execution.
The chieftains, brave and solemn, walked in defiance to the stage, fearlessly. With free hands they placed their heads in the nooses, motioned to commence the act of injustice.
Soon after, the chieftain's legs twitched a final time. The dwarves forced the 29 children back into the great hall, jabbing the little ones with the sharp points of their battle axes. Jorgos then instructed the 71 adult Orga to prepare their peoples to
march west until the Orga find new mountains. Jorgos then threatened his awestruck enemies. If you refuse, it will be an act of war. I will execute the children for justice and march to smoke out all Orga from their caves.
The dwarves then marched the Orga children to the cold, dank dungeons of the mountain fortress and chased the adults out the ancient gates of Peline to deliver the ultimatum to their tribes. The Orga succumbed to the threat of genocide, in part, not in whole. Footnote 25. The Orga marched for over 1 year to reach the Orphean Mountains. Many of their people died during what came to be known as the March of Grief. The severity of the ordeal is lost to us today, for the Orga regarded the passion of grief as the exact opposite of the passion of rage. The name signified the powerlessness the Orga experienced during the long trek. It should not be overlooked that upon arriving at the Orphean Ranges, the Orga met a peaceful settlement of Anthropodon. In the first act that earned the Orga their disdainful reputations in the West Lyman, the Orga set upon the settlement and seized 683 Anthropodon men and women with which to inseminate and bear children. The Orga learned well the lesson. They must have magicians, healers, and other arcanists to defend themselves against the dwarves in the future. And thus we find as well tied into the horrific events in the early epochal primes of the Arcane Age, the origin of the half-Orga, who lived and allied with the Orga of the Orphean mountain range. Vasili Studi provides an account based on records subsequently lost to posterity in the History of Orga. From Syracuse, circa 2531 of the Metal Age, Book 13. End footnote. In his account of the first contact between the Provenance and the Lyman, Tigris teaches us a significant lesson. The boundaries of the four Lymans were not boundaries on a map. They also represented the boundaries of self-governance to the peoples of the Provenance. The provenantial citizens created and preserved for themselves the concepts of liberty, equality, and fraternity. For the peoples of the Lyman, they created and preserved the prejudice that some cultures lacked the capacity for self-governance. If one can imagine a foreign traveler visiting the Provenance in its formative epochal primes, the interloping foreigner may erroneously believe that the Provenance persisted in relative peace for most of the Arcane Age. Bounded by oceans, tundra, and an impassable desert on three sides, with the oppressive godheads deposed and the sorcerer Titios seemingly driven from the continent, the Domain appeared to be protected from foreign invasion, entangling alliances, and internecine strife for a millennium or more. Yet this Paleonic gloss on the course of provenantial history neglects the undeclared war against the peoples of the Lyman that concretely shaped the movement of peoples in the Domain and the historical exigencies of the Arcane Age. In truth, the Provenance, born in revolution and matured by the brutality of expansionism, brought forth a civilization engrossed by conflict as much as, if not more than, by liberty. A peculiar blindness prevented the people and the councils of the Provenance from recognizing their prejudices, and in the final analysis contributed to the decline and fall of the world's first democratic society. Footnote 26. See Harold Getman, The End of Provenantial Culture, published in Amherst, 751 of the Golden Age, and Essai Misere, Discourse on Provenantial Colonialism, published in New York, 709 of the Golden Age. End footnote. A peculiar blindness prevented the people in the councils of the Provenance from recognizing their prejudices, and in the final analysis contributed to the decline and fall of the world's first democratic society. When confronted by the new cultures of the Lyman, the peoples of the Provenance determined some fit and others unfit for self-governance, a malignant arrogance that incited many unnecessary confrontations and eventually corrupted the democratic virtues of the Provenance. And this concludes Chapter 10 of Arcane Cage.